This episode is sponsored by Now What's Next, a Morgan Stanley podcast that helps make sense of life after the pandemic. Host Sonari Glinton talks with people about how they are rethinking age-old assumptions and finding new opportunities. Now What's Next? This episode is sponsored by Now What's Next, a Morgan Stanley podcast that helps make sense of life after the pandemic. Host Sonari Glinton talks with people about how they are rethinking age-old assumptions and finding new opportunities. Now What's Next?
This is the FCB Radio Network, home of the best personalities and where real talk lives. Online at fcbradio.com. FCB.
I pray the Lord my soul to take, that we won't mistake, that we won't mistake. All we got is us, no one can take that away. So don't mistake, it's gonna be okay. I pray the Lord my soul to take, that we won't mistake, that we won't mistake. All we got is us, no one can take that away. So don't mistake, it's gonna be okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Just Listen to Yourself with Kira Davis. I am your host, Kira Davis, and this is the podcast where we take talking points on hot topics, hot button issues, and we break down those talking points because sometimes when we examine the things we're saying, we're not saying exactly what we think we are. So, of course, as always, this is an exercise in critical thinking, and we do that by exploring our ideas. I do that by taking us through different arguments, trying to present different sides of arguments that perhaps you haven't heard. And then, of course, engaging you all, asking you all to have your say as well. And I get a lot of responses on this show. I don't get to every one, but I appreciate every letter, every time you reach out. It just gives me so much peace to know that there are other people like me out there who want to think through things. We don't always agree, and that is fine. And I have sometimes even had my mind changed by the things that you guys have responded with. So today we're going to do another listener response. It's been well over a month, and I've had a few since our last talk. And I know that the news cycle this week is super crazy. So I feel like maybe this is the time to do a listener response. I did nation building last week, and I actually haven't received any listener responses on the nation building episode yet, but we've been having great discussions over on my subscription page, davisnation.locals.com, davisnation.locals.com, and we've been talking about that episode over there and how we feel about all this stuff. So join us over there. Right now, actually, they have a special. If you buy a year's subscription, you get 2 months free. Not bad. And what you're doing when you subscribe is you're just helping me stay out here, helping me pay the bills so that my voice can be out here, and over there it's uncensored. Naturally, we do have to edit ourselves somewhat in this space, so that's a space where I can feel uncensored, and you all can too. Anyways, join us over there if you care to, but I'm desperate to hear from you guys about the nation building. So if you have thoughts, please let me know, because I need clarity. I don't think I came away from that episode feeling one way or the other. And given what's happening in Afghanistan as I record this, I just think it's an interesting subject for us to think through together, because I think we're going to have to consider that more and more as we move forward with this administration. What's happened, not to make this the Afghanistan episode, but what's happening over there is surely going to make us a little bit more vulnerable in the future. And so we're probably going to have more military actions moving forward. ISIS is already moving in on the airport there as I record. And all of a sudden ISIS is back, right? Like, we didn't really hear about those guys for a few years, except in deep dive reports. And now they're back in the popular lexicon. So I think that nation building is going to be something we're going to be talking about more as we move into the future. That and isolationism, like versus, right? So let's think it through. Let's get our positions solidified, or at least on the road to being solidified. Now, email me at jlty@protonmail.com, jlty@protonmail.com. I have just a few responses that they're on older subjects, but they got in like right after I did the last listener response. So I wanted to share those with you. They're a little older. A couple of these are on voter law. This one's from Catherine. I can't remember if I read this one from Catherine or not, but I feel like I didn't. So forgive me. I didn't go back and listen to my episode to see, but forgive me. But Catherine says, Kira, thank you for your show. You've really helped me get a firm and grounded perspective, and you've changed my mind on some things. Not an easy task. I feel you, Catherine. Same here. I'm writing to you about the Texas voter law episode. Oh, yes, that burner of an episode. 4 episodes on voter law, you guys. But no excuses. Now no one has any excuse. You guys know what was going on. You had mentioned vote by mail and some of the problems with it, and I thought I'd expand a bit. I'm a rural mail carrier in the state of Oregon. Here we have vote by mail. As someone involved in distributing ballots, I can tell you this system is not good. I try to be really organized and keep the names of all the residents in the boxes, but my route has high turnover, and some people don't tell me when they've moved in or out, or don't bother to put in a forward when they move. I bring back the ballots for bad names to my supervisor. I don't know what happens to them after this, but a few times I just find them right back in my mail a couple of days later, even though I don't know that name or I recognize it, but that person has moved out. Other carriers and substitute carriers I know don't look as closely at the names on the ballots. These ballots go out to everyone they have that's registered to vote, which in this state is now done automatically when you get a driver's license. Same in California. It used to be you had to put a stamp on it if you wanted the Postal Service to send it out for you, but it's now prepaid by us taxpayers. The system is so bad. I don't know how much fraud happens, but I imagine a lot. Most people I talked to received ballots for old residents or roommates they used to have years ago. I wish we had a voting system I could be proud of here. Anyway, keep up the great work, Kira. You're a voice of reason in a sea of angry sensationalists. And thank you for that encouragement, Catherine. And that is kind of what I was saying on that episode, right? Like the mail-in ballot issue, it is a big issue. I have to admit that I'm a bit perplexed by anyone who defends mail-in balloting as infallible, or that, oh, well, it has problems but not many problems. In a country where your most important right is the right to vote, it just seems risky. It just seems logical to think that it would be risky to send that through the mail. And then when you do things like you send everyone a mail-in ballot, you register everyone automatically, there's kind of no barriers for people who aren't supposed to be voting to vote. Now, you can say, well, maybe on the other end they do the signature verification and all of that, but I don't know why we would want to flood that area of the machine. You know, the vote counters are already under a lot of pressure, so I don't know why we would want to add more stress to that job, which would increase the chances of mistakes or even fraud. I don't know why we want to do that when we could easily stop that by just doing simple things like, even if you have an all mail-in ballot, votes, even if you have all that, just doing simple things like motor voter registration is a terrible idea, because not every person that registers for a driver's license is eligible to vote. I mean, here in California, you can get a driver's license as an illegal immigrant, which really makes you eligible to vote at this point. At this point, there's nothing, you don't need an ID to vote. And the only thing that would prevent your vote from being counted is if someone verified it against an address, which they would find if they went to the motor voter rolls, right? But there's nothing on your ID that would say you're here illegally. There are no fail safes here in California, and I imagine in Oregon too. So I just don't understand why people don't question the process. Here in California, we don't even have a chain of custody for ballots, for paper ballots. We don't know where they go. No one has to register who picked it up, where they drove, who they handed it over to. We don't have that here. So I don't know how we make sure that ballots aren't fake. I mean, just the other day, a drug dealer was caught in a Southern California town. He had a big bag full of guns, drugs, and 300 mail-in ballots. How and why? You know what I'm saying? Like, I get that people feel shy, a little bit gun shy about using the F word these days, fraud. But I don't think it's unreasonable to at least express a little hesitation, especially given this letter from Catherine, who is a mail carrier and who is saying, look, even at my micro level here in this process, even I see that there are big, big problems. I have 3 voters in my house. I have 3 mail-in ballots for the recall election sitting on my counter right now. I prefer to vote in person, so I'll be doing that. Then I'll be voting for Assemblyman Kevin Kiley. And, of course, I'll be voting yes to recall Gavin Newsom. And don't panic, everybody. It doesn't matter who we vote for on the second question. First question's the only one that matters. Whoever gets the most votes on the second question wins. That's how that goes. So I'm not splitting any votes, nothing like that. At least not for question 1. That being said, I've got these 3 ballots, and if 2 of the, I know I'm going to vote, but if 2 of the other voters in my house choose not to, which that's not really a choice in the Davis house, but let's pretend that the men in this house have a choice about whether or not they want to vote. If they don't want to vote, what do you think happens to those ballots? I know what I'll do with those ballots. I'll shred them. But that's because I'm a little bit more informed about this system and how it can be abused. But most people, I think the average person would just throw it away, which you should be able to, but would just throw it away. What happens after they reach the trash? I mean, there's a lot of people who pick through trash, through a lot of things. So I'm not saying that there always is fraud, but it's certainly ripe for fraud. And I don't think it's strange to question the safety of mail-in ballots. I've said it before, but I just think we need to go back to the system of you get there the day of, put some ink on your finger, you blot your finger there, and you go home. And if you can't get to the polls that day, oh well. See you next time. Unless you're out absentee, you're out of your state or your service, the way we used to do it. I don't know. Well, thank you for that letter, Catherine, and keep on fighting the good fight. And don't feel like you're being a Karen if you talk about these issues or want to report even some of these issues to your higher ups. There are Karens in this world, and they do deserve to be shamed, but there are also people who are just concerned, and we need those people. Shaming those people is a deliberate tactic to keep people from, quote, being, quote, snitches. But our democracy, the protection of our democracy takes place on all levels, even your personal level. That's why, for me, I go to vote in person. I don't have to, but I choose to. That's my little way of helping to protect democracy. Thanks for that letter, Catherine. And I just want to remind everybody at this point to head over to iTunes and give the show a rating. I'm aiming for 1,000 positive reviews. Give us a 5-star rating and a review. It helps so much. I appreciate it. And share this show with someone. Pick an episode that you think they might enjoy. I have the full spectrum. I even have romantic advice on here. So I kind of want to get to some relationship issues in the near future, but I know I've got some political issues to get out of the way here first. Next week's episode will be interesting. I'm interested to hear about next week's episode. So let me just tell you what's going on here. This next 2 weeks for me is going to be about the craziest time I'm going to have all year, God willing. We've got the recall election coming up. I'm stumping hard for my candidate, Kevin Kiley. Go to KileyForCalifornia.com if you want to know more about him. And I am also taking my son to college finally next week in Chicago. He's been in limbo for about a year. He's been working now, and we're proud of him. He started basically when school was closed. When high school closed in 2020, he just went to work. He could do all his homework from home. So he just got a 9-to-5er and worked and went to school until he graduated. So he basically worked the last half of his high school year and then worked all this past year. He's working for Chef Andrew Gruel at Slapfish in Laguna. beach, and he's working right up until the day before we leave. He's going to earn as much money as he can. So anyways, and I love that. I guess I'm bragging on him a little bit. Anyways, so we got to do that, which is definitely going to affect my emotional health, but I shall persevere. And then when we come home, more recall work, and then I'm taking a much needed vacation because I need a reset. I am burned out, and I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to feel like I'm phoning it in for you guys, and I don't want to be doing that. I feel very passionate about my job, but as you can imagine, my job also requires focusing on all of the negativity that's out there and all of the angst and anxiety as it relates to politics and culture, and that can really affect your spirit. So it's really important for people who work in this business, people like me anyways, maybe there are stronger people out there, but people like me, to build in breaks where I just black out media and I don't really get online at all and I don't do any work. And I find doing that twice a year for a week or two at a time is enough to reset. So anyways, I don't mean to belabor this point, but you can tell I'm getting kind of tired, and I just want you to know that's what's happening. So I won't be recording new episodes, but you will be getting best of episodes. You'll be getting something to, tide you over, and I'll still drop the mini episodes, and we won't be apart that long, I promise. Just hang in there with me. I'm going to go get my mind right so I can come back charged up. But I'm dropping this episode next week that I think is kind of going to be controversial because I'm going on vacation. And I think okay, if people get nasty about it or if people get angry about it, I'll be on my media blackout and I won't have to deal with it. So stay tuned for next week's episode. You're definitely going to want to hear it, and I'm definitely going to want to hear back from you about it. The next letter I have is from Alex. She is a member of our locals community. Alexis. She's a member of our locals community, davisnation.locals.com. We have a growing little group of people over there that I just love. It's quickly become a very encouraging and thoughtful community. And we talk about anything and everything. So get on over there. So Alexis writes in, this question's kind of long. She says, "That's okay, Alexis. We like to go long on this show." Hi, it's Alexis from the locals community. This question's kind of long, so I thought I'd email it rather than write it in the comments, which I appreciate because then you get to be a part of these listener responses. I don't like to discuss the comments on my Davis Nation page because it's a private page. And so I just assume that the people who are commenting there are commenting because they want to do it in this private group. So I generally won't share those comments. If I do, it'll be anonymous. And I always keep our more controversial threads. They're always private. There are some settings where maybe people can see the subject of the discussion on locals, but I'll always keep that stuff private. So yeah, locals people, if you want to be included in a listener response, you definitely have to send me an email because I won't out you from our locals page. And that's jlty@protonmail.com. Okay, Alexis, she says, my coworker is a black man in his mid-30s. I'm a white woman in my mid-30s. 37 still counts as mid, right? Sure. We'll do what we want. We started around the same time, have both expressed interest in leadership roles, and seem to be on the same career development path. He lives in the neighboring city, a yuppie middle-class suburb of South Denver. From everything I can tell, we have followed the same path and so far have ended up in the same place in life. After George Floyd, he started positing things like, why does America love black culture but hate black people? While it's entirely possible that he's experienced specific instances of racism in his life, I've had a hard time understanding his perception that the whole world hates him. It makes me think of my psychology days and things like perception and self-fulfilling prophecy. If you see the world through that lens, you'll find racism everywhere. At the same time, there might be specific instances of true racism that he's experienced, and I don't want to minimize that. I know you've addressed similar topics on your show before, but I still don't know if there's an appropriate way for a white person to challenge or even question a non-white person on their perceptions of racism. It reminds me of the story of the dress shop you've told before, and that's the story of my good friend Stacey Washington going in and buying a dress and being followed all over the store. And when she shared that with white conservatives, everybody told her that she misconstrued the situation. You mentioned a lot of white people pushed back saying the same thing happened to them, so how can you be sure it was due to racism? I got the impression that you would not recommend that tactic. I really would not. I mean, would you, though, Alexis, or anybody else? Is that if you were telling somebody about an instance, something that hurt you, something that really hurt your feelings or hurt you deeply, would you want the response to be, oh, you misread that? You know, I mean, nobody wants that. Forget about the situation, the circumstances. Nobody, that's not what people want to hear when they share something personal with you. Okay. But should we always accept someone's perception of racism as truth? This is an excellent question, Alexis. She goes on to say, I know a large part of leftist propaganda is to convince everybody that they are victims. I'd love to help challenge that mindset without ignoring any real instances of racism or hate that they've experienced. Or is it not my place to say anything? This is a loaded email. I'm sorry it took me so long to get to this, but because this is extremely relevant. But Alexis asks some excellent questions here. All right, the first one, given this example of this guy, he said, why does America love black culture and hate black people? I mean, that's a loaded statement, first of all. And I don't know how a white person is supposed to respond to that, particularly a white person who doesn't hate black people, which I believe is most white people in America. I don't know what how you're supposed to respond to that, because the premise of the question is faulty. It makes an assumption off the bat, right? It presupposes that we all agree that America hates black people. Now, have American institutions been cruel to black people, subjugated black people, oppressed black people, ignored and neglected black people? Yes. But America has also done a lot to correct those mistakes. I'm not going to go back and relitigate this. We've come a long way, I suppose, is the short way of saying all that without getting into all that argument. I guess the point is that I don't know that it's true that America hates black people. There are some people, some in the government and some next door to us, who hate black people. There are some institutions that affect black people negatively. And in the past, it was federal policy to treat black people like slaves, literally. So we know those things are true. But I think to say in 2021, to posit that, I think that Alexis is right, that there's a deeper hurt here. And I would say, Alexis, that's another point of view to consider in this. Like, I would never have said that. And I don't think it's fair that he said that. As I said, it presupposes something that I don't think is true. And you surely don't either. And you surely don't think that way, right? You don't, I feel confident in saying you don't hate black people. You're a member of Davis Nation. But as you pointed out from your psychology courses, sometimes our hurt informs everything around us. And sometimes when people are mad, it's because they have something to be mad about. Now, maybe this gentleman has taken his anger and his fear and his hurt and amplified it, because we certainly have a news media and entertainment culture these days that really amplifies victimhood, that we have found some kind of nobility in that. And so it almost feels good to be a victim in a way. There's almost a kind of power in it, at least a psychological power. And at least it feels like, hey, at least people are paying attention to me now. So he may not have experienced George Floyd levels of abuse, but he may be responding to, just because it might look to you like you guys took the same path. And I'm sure largely you did take the same path, but it is still, I believe, a very different experience taking that path as a black person than as a white person. My kids have been raised in nothing but cushiness. We moved from Gary, Indiana when they were both very young. Their lives are basically Orange County suburban middle class kids. That's the life they know. But they still do face certain prejudices, and we have had, as I've talked about openly on the show, incidences in our own neighborhood that were racially related and hurtful. I've told the story about how even my son likes to climb the fence at the clubhouse down the street because they have a vending machine. And when he wants, well, before he could drive, he can drive to the store now, but before he could drive, when he wanted a snack, he'd go and waste $3 on a candy bar at the vending machine, but he'd always forget his card key. So sometimes it'd be 10 o'clock at night, he'd be climbing that fence. And I'd be like, how'd you get in? You didn't have your car key. And he'd be like, oh, I just climbed the fence. And I would always say to him, you have to understand that you climbing the fence of the clubhouse at 10 o'clock at night is going to look different than your blonde-haired, blue-eyed best friend climbing that fence. Because a lot of people around here are blonde hair and blue-eyed, but almost no one is black. Almost no one. And not that people would be out there intentionally looking to pin things on a black man, but to the eyes of many people here, you look out of place because there's not many people like you. And so to them, it's going to look different. So there are some things that you have to be cognizant of. Sometimes you have to deal with people questioning your intelligence, questioning your value. Are you here because you're an affirmative action hire, or are you here because you really earned your place? Sometimes you have to deal with the soft bigotry of low expectations. That can really rattle you. That can cause resentment. Sometimes you deal with out and out racism. And just because he's not talking about the racism he's experienced in his life doesn't mean that he hasn't experienced it. Oftentimes, people like him, if he was raised in that suburban area, he might not have a lot of people to talk to about the racism he's experienced. You know, sometimes we keep those things to ourselves in shame. I know it sounds crazy, but when I was growing up in Canada and dealing with very vile racism, I have a lot of friends who will tell you that, friends from high school who will tell you, Kira seemed fine. I don't even remember her really complaining that much about the abuse, but it was shameful to complain about it, you know, to get caught in the back of the school with the two bullies that were the worst offenders and have to endure a beating or have to endure like a taunting, or in the winter, these guys like to put icicles and snowballs and throw them. That's not fun. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to tell people that you got beat up or you got shamed or rejected. So those are possibilities. I'm not saying that is his experience, but I am saying maybe one perspective, Alexis, is that to you it looks like you've taken the same path, but it may indeed be a very different path based on your perspectives.
This episode is sponsored by Now What's Next, a Morgan Stanley podcast that helps make sense of life after the pandemic. Host Sonari Glinton talks with people about how they are rethinking age-old assumptions and finding new opportunities. Now, what's next? There's a new podcast called Now What's Next from Morgan Stanley. It's filled with stories of people trying to adapt to and look beyond the global crisis we're facing. Chefs, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, grounded world travelers. There's even an astronaut. Their stories are unique and their outlooks are optimistic. Listen to Now What's Next wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey y'all, this is Sarah Lee with Marble Halls and Silver Screens, coming to you today to remind you that if you're curious about all the news coming out of the Marble Halls of Washington, D.C., but don't have the patience for the mainstream media's take on it, this podcast is for you. I cover all the news that breaks over the week from D.C. and then attempt to translate it into what it means for a conservative American audience searching for answers amongst the spin. The Silver Screens part of the program covers the overlap between the entertainment industry and politics, which is significant, and then I offer my own thoughts on some of the newest streaming options and films as they're released. So join me on Fridays for a breakdown of what's happening in politics and movies, and be sure to subscribe to Marble Halls and Silver Screens, an FCB radio podcast, at Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcast. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and come back soon.
I want to address what you said about self-fulfilling prophecy, and I think that is another thing as well. I do think that there is an element of, you could call it self-fulfilling prophecy, or maybe even just, if racism is all you think about, racism is all you'll see everywhere. And so small interactions, or interactions that are really just like negative interactions that are really just a result of human nature or just personality differences, can come to look like racism to a person who is convinced that everyone in the world is racist. And that's a problem too. How do you respond to that? How do you respond to this guy insinuating that everyone around him hates Black culture and hates him? And I'm just not sure, because a lot of it would depend on, I think any kind of response when it comes to heated stuff like this depends on how well you know the person, right? If this is a friend, you might want to reassure the friend that of course you don't sign on to that, and you do support him. But I think sometimes you just got to let people talk. Like, you're not going to, unless he's asking you a direct question or asking for your opinion, maybe you just got to let him say those things, and just not respond. That's the hardest thing. But like, what would a response do? Would it convince him? Would it make him more amenable to your point of view? Would it make him friendlier? Would it strengthen your relationship? Would it make him trust you more? I'm not saying hide your opinion, but I am saying be very discerning. Not because you need to tiptoe around him. You do you, but just because what's going to make your life easier or better, what's going to make you feel better. Now, you may get to a point, Alexis, where you feel like, no, this is absolutely a lie. I cannot go without commenting. And I think you'll know when you're there. And then when you do decide to respond, make sure it's a strong response, not a wishy-washy, but just, and don't even try to defend it. Drop your opinion and go. Let them ruminate. That's one way. But as always, and I think I've used this term many times on this show before, there's no one way to do things. You have to be discerning. And how do you get that discernment? You practice critical thinking. And then you'll be able to analyze the situations and know whether or not this is the time for you to say something, or simply this is the time for you to listen and say to yourself, hey, I think this is a load of bull, but he might be speaking out of a pain that has exaggerated, these opinions. And so I'm going to respect that. And then your last question, you say here is, or your last group of questions, which I'll kind of condense into one. You say that I'd love to challenge this mindset, but not ignore real instances. Is it my place to say anything? Like, if my Black friend says, hey, I got followed around the store the other day because I'm Black, and I say, hey, I did too. 2 weeks ago, same thing happened to me. Should I say that at all? Or how do I respond? Is there ever a time when I can say, hey, what you experience is not racism? I don't think you can ever say that if you're not there. And that goes for anything. Again, I'd like to point you back to you. If you were telling somebody about a scary experience you had, like I was walking late at night to my car one night and the scary guy was following me and he started chasing me and I managed to run into a coffee shop and I got away from him, and everyone goes, oh, that happens to everybody, or that, oh, you know what? He was probably just walking to his car. You overreacted. How are you going to feel about that? You're going to feel like you weren't there. You don't know. So if someone's telling you about an experience that they have, internally, you might be rolling your eyes, but I don't think it's ever appropriate. As much as you want to, I don't know that it's ever appropriate to say, I don't think that's what you experienced, because you weren't there. And that is why a lot of people choose emotion and personal anecdote to make arguments, because they know that you can't combat a personal narrative, right? What kind of a jerk are you if you're going to tell me I'm not feeling what I'm really feeling? How do you know what I'm feeling? You don't know my life, right? Emotion is easy. It requires no defense. And that is why being able to critically examine your ideas can help take the emotion out, which takes the tension out, which takes out our our tendency to amplify negativity. But sometimes you have to recognize that people are emotional. Like Ben Shapiro says, facts don't care about your feelings, but looks like feelings don't really care about facts either. So that street is a two-way street. Yeah, I would avoid picking apart other people's personal experiences. But I agree with you that just because somebody has experienced racism once or twice or sometimes in their life certainly doesn't mean that every experience they have with a non-Black person is a racist experience. And it's unfair of us as Black people to distribute that burden among every other person who isn't Black, just automatically. Okay, thank you so much for that response, Alexis. Really appreciated it. Really, really great questions. Really great questions. I have a feeling we'll keep talking about that because I think this is one of those subjects that'll keep coming up. If you have other examples, let's keep this conversation going, open. I don't think the questions are the problem. I think the problem comes when we stop asking questions. So as long as you guys are asking questions, we're on the right path, even if we don't always get all the answers. All right, here's another great one from Rob. Rob has some comments on the voting law, the very fascinating voting laws. Thank you, Rob, for listening to those. I feel like I should give you some kind of medal. Rob says, after I listened to your podcast episodes on voting laws, I noticed that you never addressed the assumptions that, in my opinion, seem to drive both the laws and the reactions to them. Those assumptions are that more of the total people in the U.S. tend to vote for Democrats, but more of the likely voters tend to vote for Republicans. So Republicans want to reduce voting fraud because they assume all their voters are going to show up at the polls anyway. But Democrats are going to get more people voting who ordinarily either would not vote or would be ineligible. And the Republicans believe they need to crack down to prevent these people from voting for Democrats. And Democrats are against these voting laws because they want to make voting easier for those same people who would normally either not vote or be ineligible, since Democrats believe most of these people will vote for them. My question is, why do both major political parties share these assumptions, and how much truth is in them? Also, what would you suggest that could be done about it? I enjoy listening to your perspectives. Thank you for all you do on your podcast. Thank you, Rob. Thanks for gutting through those voting law episodes. And I'm actually really glad that you sent this email because it in itself makes some assumptions that I don't think are true. So I think it's good to pick this apart a little bit. And then you ask the questions you ask are great also as well. But you say Republicans want to reduce voting fraud because they assume all their voters are going to show up at the polls anyway. But Democrats are going to get more people voting who ordinarily either would not vote or would be ineligible. That is not true. Nothing about that statement is true. Republicans don't want to reduce voting fraud because they assume that their people are going to show up at the polls. They want to reduce voting fraud because voting fraud is illegal. It's illegal. It's illegal for someone who is ineligible to vote. That's the law. And so the reason why Republicans push so hard to go to the polls instead of mail-in balloting is because that is more secure than a mail-in ballot. And the reason why Republicans want you to do things like register to vote on your own and be able to verify your address and show ID is to protect the integrity of that vote. When you don't have these requirements, as you pointed out, or at least implied in the rest of this email, then anybody can vote. Then anybody can get, and I explained the situation here in California. So it's not that Republicans feel like, oh, if only we could get those mail-in people to stop voting, Republicans would win every election. That's not it at all. Voter fraud is illegal. So how do you stop voter fraud? This might go to your last question. You stop voter fraud by shoring up the voter system. You stop voter fraud by making sure that ballots can't be duplicated, that signatures can be checked, that cheating on a mass level that can't happen, that there are observers, that people with identification vote so that we know that it's the right person using their one vote. These are things that you can do. These are all things that Georgia law and Texas law are doing. And you say the assumptions are that the more total people in the U.S. tend to vote for Democrats. That's not true either. That's absolutely not true. I don't know where you got that idea, or where you got that number. It's almost always been 50-50. That is the thing that nobody will ever tell you. I wrote an op-ed about after the election, at the 2020 election, when we were still all in limbo. And one of the things I was complaining about is that I couldn't believe how nasty a lot of Democrat and liberal pundits in the media were being. Like, I thought they should be happy. They won. You know, I mean, I know there was still, like, we were going through the whole courts thing and counting, but they knew they won. Their guy won. Trump was gone. Like, it seemed like they should be really celebratory, but they were so angry. They were still so angry that there could be that many people in the country who voted for Trump. And I wrote this article saying, look, these people didn't just appear with Trump. They've always been here. The country's always been split, almost 50-50. It's actually quite incredible, even when you consider how quickly the culture has been moving left over the last 100 years. It really is incredible. This country is split 50-50, and as a matter of fact, it's really a rural and suburban culture versus city culture, not Democrat versus Republican. You can look on voting maps and you can see that the country is actually largely red. And it is Democrat voters in these city centers who make up the numbers for the Democrat voters. But no, it's absolutely not true that most of the people in the United States would vote for Democrats if they could. Everybody can if they want. And still consistently, statistically, about half of Americans vote on either side. So that's another false assumption that you laid out in the beginning of this. I'm not sure where you get that. If my numbers are wrong, tell me. But that's not an assumption. That's your assumption. That's not an assumption we in the punditry class hold. That's not an assumption anybody I know who works in voter integrity holds. That's not an assumption any statistician I know holds. So no, I don't subscribe to that assumption. Again, I think that's your assumption. That's not anybody else's.
There's a new podcast called Now What's Next from Morgan Stanley. It's filled with stories of people trying to adapt to and look beyond the global crisis we're facing. Chefs, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, grounded world travelers. There's even an astronaut. Their stories are unique and their outlooks are optimistic. Listen to Now What's Next wherever you get your podcasts. There's a new podcast called Now What's Next from Morgan Stanley. It's filled with stories of people trying to adapt to and look beyond the global crisis we're facing. Chefs, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, grounded world travelers. There's even an astronaut. Their stories are unique and their outlooks are optimistic. Listen to Now What's Next wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey y'all, this is Sarah Lee with Marble Halls and Silver Screens, coming to you today to remind you that if you're curious about all the news coming out of the Marble Halls of Washington, D.C., but don't have the patience for the mainstream media's take on it, this podcast is for you. I cover all the news that breaks over the week from D.C. and then attempt to translate it into what it means for a conservative American audience searching for answers amongst the spin. The Silver Screens part of the program covers the overlap between the entertainment industry and politics, which is significant, and then I offer my own thoughts on some of the newest streaming options and films as they're released. So join me on Fridays for a breakdown of what's happening in politics and movies, and be sure to subscribe to Marble Halls and Silver Screens, an FCB radio podcast, at Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcast. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and come back soon.
You say Republicans believe they need to crack down to prevent these people from voting for Democrats. No, Republicans believe they need to crack down to prevent Democrats from making up votes. So it's not about stopping people from voting. It's from stopping false voting. It's from stopping duplicate votes. It's from stopping fraudulent votes. The idea isn't to keep people from voting. The idea is to promote citizens voting. You are ineligible to vote if you're not a citizen by our laws. That doesn't apply everywhere. As I just said, I told you what happens here in California. But that's the law. That's the Constitution. So it isn't about preventing people from voting. It's from preventing fraudulent votes. It really doesn't have to do with voters. It has to do with votes. You say Democrats are against voting laws because they want to make voting easier for those same people who would normally either not vote or be ineligible. Yeah, you're right about that. They want to make voting easier for people who normally would not vote. That's why you have motor voter registration, and people who are ineligible. That's why they oppose voter ID. That's actually correct, but that's not a good thing. You make it sound like that's a good assumption and you might not. Maybe that wasn't your intention. Maybe you're being sarcastic about that. But yeah, that is what Democrats believe, and those aren't good things. People who normally wouldn't vote, I don't know that you want to be making it easier for those people. And how much easier can you make it? You need nothing. You don't even need an address to vote here in California. You don't need an ID. You don't need a resident. And you can get a hold of multiple ballots, and good luck checking addresses against people who don't have addresses. What do you think happens to those ballots? Do they get thrown away? I think like some of you are probably nodding your head. Yeah, of course. But how do you know? We don't have a chain of custody here in California. We don't know. We don't know. So again, and in the same respect, I don't think that Democrats believe I think to a certain extent, Democrats feel like open borders are good because immigrants will come in, and then when they're legalized to vote, they'll vote for us. I do believe that there's that attitude. I don't think it's necessarily true. I don't even think statistics bear that out, and certainly not here in California, where the majority of Latino voters are actually in favor of recalling Gavin Newsom. So I don't know that that's true, but I'm willing to concede that that is certainly a mindset on the Democrat side, that these people will vote for us if they can. To go back to my point about people who don't normally vote, I don't know that that's a good thing. For people who don't normally vote to be doing everything we can to get them to vote. If they don't want to vote, why would we be so hard pressed to have them come down on one side or the other? Do you know what I mean? You can do that with your friends and families. I mean, we're all become little evangelists around election time. I get that. But I think that there are a lot of people, if you don't want to vote, you shouldn't vote. Because if you don't want to vote, you're probably not informed on the issues. So no, not everybody has to vote. And so then why would Democrats want people who wouldn't normally vote why would they want to make it as easy as possible for those people to vote? That's a question you should answer for yourself. Because we're not talking about informed people. If you don't normally vote, then you're not really informed, either about the issues or the process. You don't care. And there's a lot of people in this country who don't care. They just leave it up to the rest of us to do it. So this isn't an issue, Rob, of these assumptions. I disagree that they carry these assumptions. I believe that voter integrity is what Republicans are after, because they don't trust a ballot system that can be easily manipulated. And I think I did point out, I won't rehash, but I think I did point out on all 4 of those episodes, why mail-in ballots are vulnerable. And then Democrats, I believe right now, I just believe it's a wedge issue. I don't even know how passionate they really are about it. But I do think that Democrats, I think you nailed it when you said that they think people who are ineligible to vote would vote for them. So then the question becomes, why do Democrats want people who are ineligible to vote? If it's against the law, why are you working to get ineligible people to vote? Unless you think those people all should be eligible. But the people you're talking about are people who are who are in the country illegally. What would I suggest to be done about all this? Voter ID laws, scaling back mail-in ballots, which are inherently vulnerable, shaving off time for early elections. I really don't think we should have early elections at all, but this is a big society with a lot of people. We could come to a compromise, but I tend to think that a month of voting is too much. A lot can happen in a month to change a person's vote. And again, the longer there is to vote, the more vulnerable the voting system is. I do think we need to increase observers at voting locations. We need to end motor voter registration. I think that would end a lot of fraud because what happens is then people get registered to vote and they might not be eligible to vote, and now they're clogging up the voter rolls. And for Democrats or Republicans, that's not a good thing. Especially what we've seen in 2020. We don't want any more hotly contested elections. How do we avoid that, Rob? We avoid that by making sure that the security of our elections are shored up so people don't have so much to complain about. One thing you do is you clear the voter rolls of dead voters, of people who have moved, so there's less a chance for fraud, or forget fraud, just confusion. Just taking up the time to verify these signatures. I mean, we all witness what happened when results are delayed. Americans should know who their president is the night of the election. That's how it should be. So that's how I think we solve those problems, which coincidentally is what the two voter laws in Georgia and Texas aim to do. Rob, thank you for your listen. Thank you for your awesome letter and giving me the opportunity to expound on those thoughts.
15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
My dad used to say that.
Sure, yeah. It's from Geico.
Yeah, whenever I would ask my dad for life advice, he'd sit me down and say, son, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more. And look at me now, a well-adjusted adult with a drawer full of plastic bags I'll never use.
Okay, I'm confused. Was your dad a licensed Geico agent?
Nah, he was just a real good dad.
Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
There's a new podcast called Now What's Next from Morgan Stanley. It's filled with stories of people trying to adapt to and look beyond the global crisis we're facing. Chefs, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, grounded world travelers. There's even an astronaut. Their stories are unique and their outlooks are optimistic. Listen to Now What's Next wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey y'all, this is Sarah Lee with Marble Halls and Silver Screens, coming to you today to remind you that if you're curious about all the news coming out of the Marble Halls of Washington, D.C., but don't have the patience for the mainstream media's take on it, this podcast is for you. I cover all the news that breaks over the week from D.C. and then attempt to translate it into what it means for a conservative American audience searching for answers amongst the spin. The Silver Screens part of the program covers the overlap between the entertainment industry and politics, which is significant, and then I offer my own thoughts on some of the newest streaming options and films as they're released. So join me on Fridays for a breakdown of what's happening in politics and movies, and be sure to subscribe to Marble Halls and Silver Screens, an FCB radio podcast, at Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcast. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and come back soon.
And one more from Carrie Pope. I think Carrie's been on the show a couple of times with letters. Carrie says, you asked on your podcast, how could these white teachers comply with segregation in schools? And I think I was talking about the Atlanta school that is segregating classrooms. Oh my gosh. If you haven't listened to that one, if you don't know that story, go back and listen. It'll curl your toes. Anyways, simply, they've bought the lie, hook, line, and sinker. I'm putting myself in their position, assuming they've had implicit bias trainings and etc., which I absolutely assume that they have. Speaking of making assumptions. And if I'm listening to the woke CRT agenda, I'll believe what I'm actually doing is what is best for the black students. White women teachers are now told that they hold the power in our education system. Wow, Carrie. I'm going back to this. This is an excellent point. So if I'm a white teacher, I'm going to listen to my black principal when she says segregation is best. I'm going to trust her and not my own instinct, because my instincts are coming from a white supremacist worldview that I have imbibed since a young babe right out of my mother's womb. It no longer matters what is best for any student academically and what teacher is best suited for the student. It only matters that I listen to the black voices in the room and trust what they have to say. Ironically, those white women are now engaged or have engaged in what they say they're fighting against. That is the irony of CRT. They have given up their power to become racist. and in doing so, they have become what they hate. Kind regards, Carrie. Woo, that's a really good one. I want to go back to this point. First of all, you're absolutely right. 100% they've already had these trainings, so this seems normal to them. And that's what critical race theory does. This is why I oppose it. It has nothing to do with Black history or ethnic studies or equality. It has to do with the fact that CRT requires some people to be inferior so that others can be superior. This is the line that got me. You said white women teachers are now told they hold the power in the education system, that they are the problem. It seems to me that CRT is such a wonky worldview that it is accomplishing, which Carrie points out with the segregation issue, but it is accomplishing the opposite of what it says. In a way, CRT is actually making white people more powerful, not less. It's still giving them access to a type of power that only they can wield. So this teacher has told, hey, you have all the power. Oh, okay, I'm a powerful and influential person. And you have to change things for these Black students. You're the only one that can do it, white savior, right? This is just another version of the white savior complex. You're the only one who can do it. And by lowering yourself voluntarily to do this, it actually empowers you because it makes you one of the good white people. So you're still placing the power of solving this issue or making the issue worse on white people. So Black people still playing no part in fixing this. That the Black principal needed the white teacher, right? Can't have a white classroom without the white teacher. The Black principal needed the white teacher. That is placement of power, and it is placing the whole situation in the hands of the white faculty at the school. And CRT places this whole situation in the hands of white people. It's just giving white people more power, basically. Because still Black people are saying we don't have the power. We don't have the power to change anything. You guys haven't given us enough power to change anything. So you people in power still have to be the ones in power to change things. It's circular logic, but I thought that was a brilliant point you brought up, and it wasn't an angle that I had thought about. That even as they're voluntarily acquiescing this power, in a way they are becoming more powerful. And it's the Black principal that took the heat for that, of course, as she should. But again, it's just something that it makes Black people look stupid and white people look like, hey, I have the power to do this, and look what I've done with my power. Once this Black principal is gone, I'm still here because I was using my power for good. I want to say here, this is our last letter. Carrie, thank you so much for this letter. That was excellent. I want to say here that I get a lot of questions from white women about how they should respond to things like this, critical race theory nonsense that might come at them, or even legitimate concerns from, Black colleagues or classmates or whatever, when they're being accused of being racist simply for existing, or being racist just because they think classrooms should be integrated. That kind of sounds crazy to say that out loud, but that kind of stuff. What should you do? What can I do? How can I stand up for myself without feeling like I'm being racist? But this is where I genuinely feel, and excuse me while I take it to church here, that it is so important to have your identity rooted in something eternal. This is what I believe. This is why you have to turn to faith. You have to turn to the word. Now, I understand not everybody is of the same faith tradition listening to this show, and that's fine. So you substitute my words for whatever your faith tradition makes work for you. But the concept is the same. It's the idea of being rooted in an identity that is eternal and non-changing. So when everything is changing around you, the terms are changing around you, terms of engagement are changing around you, the culture is changing, you don't have to feel like you have to keep defending yourself because you know who you are. And that way, you'll know when it's time to take a strong stance and when it's time to just simply let fools be fools. You have to be able to have the confidence in who you are and what you believe. It's why we work so hard on this show to dig into these concepts. It's why we work so hard to make these arguments and even argue against ourselves. You know, you'll hear me arguing against myself sometimes. It's hard work. It takes thoughtfulness and it takes time. It takes a willingness to change your mind. And that means that is what gives you the ultimate confidence to navigate these situations, because I do think that it is a scary situation for some people in certain situations, like these teachers. This white teacher is in a school that's majority black with a majority black staff, and she's the one that dares to stand up and say, I don't think it's right to segregate these kids. I don't think these lessons are right that we're teaching. What's going to happen to her? She's going to be ridiculed. She's going to be shamed. She's going to be persecuted. She's going to be in a negative work environment. She's got a lot to think about. But it becomes a lot easier when you can stand in something that you know does not change. And then you can withstand whatever comes back. Some people will pay deep consequences, and that is that. But again, if you're rooted in your faith, you know that the Creator has you. You know that the Creator will provide for you, and that you don't have to feel concerned about the actions of man or the feelings of man. There are teachers in Loudoun County who are standing up against the school curriculum there, as well as CRT issues and a nasty school board that they're trying to recall. And there was one teacher, Tanner Cross, who said, I'm not going to obey these new laws for pronouns and transgender locker rooms. My faith doesn't allow for me to do it. I support every student, and so I can't lie to students about their biology, and I won't. And I love all my students, and that means me being the best and most honest support for them. And so I simply will not adhere to this, and so he lost his job. There's a lawsuit now, obviously. But yeah, they suspended him. Some people will pay a bigger price. Some people will be respected. You might just end up in a situation where someone goes, well, all right, I don't agree with you, but at least I know that no one can tell you what to do or what to think, that you are your own person, and I can respect that. Sometimes, depending on who you're with, that's the reaction you'll get. Again, discernment is there, but this is why it's really important, I think, to be anchored in faith and anchored in the knowledge that you are a created being who is cared for, and that man is temporary, but there is an eternal component to our lives that is much, much more meaningful. I think that's the key. I do. You may disagree. Write me, jlty@protonmail.com, jlty@protonmail.com. Thanks for hanging in there with me, everybody. Thanks for these responses. So thoughtful this month. You guys blow me away. All right, you guys, I'm exhausted, and I'm looking forward to getting this recall out of the way. If you want updates on what's going on the recall, you can follow me on Twitter @RealKiraDavis. I tweet about it every single day. I've been doing wall-to-wall media in support of this recall. Newsom is on the bubble here, you guys. I think I might do a live stream over at Davis Nation just to answer your recall questions pretty soon, maybe even the day after this drops. We'll see. What else do I have for you? I don't know. Thank you. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think about some of the responses on this episode, but really about next week's episode. So fingers crossed that we get some thoughtful responses on that one. As always, thank you for tuning in. And don't forget, every once in a while, just stop and listen to yourself.
I pray the Lord my soul to take, that we won't lose faith and we won't lose faith. All we got is us, no one can take that away. So don't lose faith, it's gonna be okay. I pray the Lord my soul to take, that we won't lose faith and we won't lose faith. All we got is us, no one can take that away. So don't lose faith, it's gonna be okay.
The FCB Radio Network. First class broadcasting worldwide.
There's a new podcast called Now What's Next from Morgan Stanley. It's filled with stories of people trying to adapt to and look beyond the global crisis we're facing. Chefs, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, grounded world travelers. There's even an astronaut. Their stories are unique and their outlooks are optimistic. Listen to Now What's Next wherever you get your podcasts. There's a new podcast called Now What's Next from Morgan Stanley. It's filled with stories of people trying to adapt to and look beyond the global crisis we're facing. Chefs, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, grounded world travelers. There's even an astronaut. Their stories are unique and their outlooks are optimistic. Listen to Now What's Next wherever you get your podcasts.